All right, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to our BDN workshop series for the fall semester. I am Dr. Cletus Allen, and I will be your moderator for today's workshop session. We have two dynamic speakers who will facilitate a workshop with us, and I would like to do introductions for them and then allow them as the experts to facilitate their workshop. So today we have Dr. Terry Cooper and Dr. Danielle Cooper. Dr. Terry Cooper is an accomplished public health and emergency management professional, boasting over 2 decades of combined experience in forensic mental health, public health, and emergency management. He is a certified emergency manager, a master exercise practitioner, and a graduate of the National Emergency Management Advanced Academy. Dr. Cooper holds a Bachelor of Science in Food Science from the University of Florida, a Master of Science in Emergency Management, and a Master in Public Health from the University of New Haven. He is a William Averett Anderson Fund Fellow and recently completed his Doctor of Health Science and Educational Leadership. So let's welcome Dr. Terry Cooper. And let's transition to Dr. Danielle Cooper. Dr. Danielle Cooper is an associate professor of criminal justice and the director of research at the Toe Youth Justice Institute at the University of New Haven. She received her PhD in criminology with a minor in organizational leadership for nonprofits from the University of Florida in 2015. For more than 15 years, she has been conducting research and teaching in the areas of youths and young adults, juvenile justice and delinquency prevention, criminological theory, and sex offending. She is also a certified prevention professional with certifications in Florida and Connecticut, who works with nonprofits and community organizations as a prevention trainer and evaluation consultant. So let's welcome Dr. Cooper and Dr. Cooper as they facilitate this workshop entitled Trauma-Informed Facilitation, Life Lessons, and Classroom Strategies.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Cletus Allen. Before we get started, we just want to thank you all for taking this time, whether it's lunchtime on the East Coast or maybe it's breakfast on the West Coast or any time in between. We know how valuable our time is. I've been calling October Worktober, so hopefully this is a bit of a restorative session for you. Hopefully part of what may be interested in you in this conversation is you're aware that there are a lot of heightened negative emotions, whether that be around the status of the world, the status of society, the status of politics. And so we really want to better inform ourselves as the Black Doctoral Network. As you have heard, this presentation is called Trauma-Informed Facilitation. We've really taken time to just really curate conversation with you all. This will be an interactive conversation where we share our life lessons, but we also want to hear from you all. And in that conversation of classroom strategies, we hope that we're taking the moment to build skills that we all will be able to count on in our times of need. So once again, just welcome to all of you all. This is actually not the first workshop that Dr. Terry Cooper and I have done with the Black Doctoral Network Workshop Series. We are proud members of this organization, and we really look forward to the opportunities to learn as members, but also to share the things that we've learned. In case the things that we teach you today make you want to go back and get some of the introductory conversation, please check out our presentation, Restorative Circles, Check-ins, and Community Building in Academic and Practical Settings, which we presented in the spring of 2023.
All right, so it is time for me to share a little bit about myself. So again, Danielle has introduced me. My name is Dr. Terry Cooper. I recently am still getting used to that title, obviously, but I was born in 1979. So while I like to present a little bit younger, I'm actually a member of Generation X. And so while that doesn't necessarily mean a lot to a lot of people, it does mean that I experienced some different things in my life that were in my impressionable phases of life. that some others might have experienced at a different time, with that being said. So some of the major events in my timeline, I think, that define who I am was that one, I had a traumatic eye injury at 5 years old, which, among other things, kind of made my family be overprotective of me. So that may have limited some of my later experiences and things like that. But I'm from a rural community in Florida, so it was a very kind of a tight-knit community, like three families on a dirt road situation, and there may be three generations there now. So then moving forward in that timeline, for me, something that was impactful, and I don't know how many of you would remember it the same, but maybe you would, was the O.J. Simpson trial, and the verdict, because I can remember being in 10th grade and watching on closed circuit television the verdict come down and seeing some of my classmates crying and some of my other classmates cheering, and it was just like a moment that I'll quite never forget. Moving forward in that, right? So I went to college in 1997. And my memory is related to music, most everything. And I can remember listening to, don't quote me, but I was listening to a version of The Blueprint on September 10th, 2001. The next day, the world changed, right? Like it was pretty, pretty potent that time. I think everybody remembers that, right? So September 11th, something I lived through as an undergraduate in college. I was in public health by the time Katrina hit New Orleans, and that changed everything again around 2005. And then in my personal life, and I would jump off and pass it to Danielle. Some things that were major events in my adult life uh, was that I went through foreclosure and bankruptcy in my mid 20s, which is at the time it was something that I was like ashamed of, but at the same time, like people like Dick Clark were going through it, like millionaires were going through this whole phase, from like 2006 through 2012, and then I had those issues afterwards. So um, I will leave with the 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 last thing that hit me this morning that I just actually added to this discussion was that I was pursuing my master's in public health in 2020. Uh, the summer of 2020,
Favorite
the
beat?
world we were in lockdown. At the same time, while pursuing this degree and being in lockdown from COVID, I was also dealing with an employment issue. And so I just say that to be that, like, there are things that happen that in reflection, I'm like, oh wait, those things had a large impact. And at the time, maybe there was so much stuff going on that I wasn't able to even prioritize or differentiate which event was occurring or which event made me feel like something else. But at the end of the day, these are some of the things that make me who I am and brought me to this space. So I'll pass it over to Danielle.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Let's see. Okay, before I go into my timeline, I just want to share, I think from my academic background, I most like to share that I am a youth advocate and a restorative practitioner as well as a preventionist. These are things that kind of set the frame of how I've come to either learn about some of the topics that we're sharing today, but this also helps create a bit of a perspective on how I think about the major life events that have occurred in my own time. So Terry Cooper is my husband, and we are slightly different in age. And so I am a millennial. And when I think about across my life, things that have really potentially molded who I am, shifted and shaped the development opportunities that I was having as a young person, there are just a few things that came specifically to mind. First and foremost, I love my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. I'm 314 all day, and I just have come to love and appreciate where I'm from. But as I have also grown older, as I have become a criminal justice professional, it's become more clear to me. Part of the environment that I was raised in is what is known as a murder capital, a place where there is plenty of crime, and that regular everyday crimes are more likely to escalate with gun violence that often leads into a homicide or some sort of loss of life that is really sometimes potentially neutralized when you see that type of information on the news as frequently as it was as I was growing up, or when you think about, I just celebrated, going back home and just being able to connect with those people, seeing who's still there, who's doing well. Other events that are similar to what Dr. Cooper mentioned, I really think about what it was like to be a young person moving into the high school space as we experienced Columbine, which took place in '99. So a lot of, how we think about in terms of school safety, the kind of conversations that we were having or that we have now around school shooter drills, or those are pieces that I was a young person at that time. Also, while I was in high school is when we experienced 9/11. So I have a very distinct memory of what it looked like for my teachers to try and help us manage what was a, national/global catastrophe that really sort of stopped what was happening in the moment. I was in a school setting where they did choose to roll in the televisions. They allowed us to see what was going on. In the Midwest in St. Louis, there is the St. Louis Arch. So we were legitimately afraid that we might be another major target based on the things that we were seeing in the news. And I take lessons, the pros and the cons from how my teachers manage those things. And then just, once again, if you fast forward in life, by the time I graduated from my bachelor's degree, at that point in time, we were experiencing, I think, what we were calling a recession at the time, a collapsing of our housing market. And that just as we have moved more into the past 10 years, there's just been, especially through the presence of social media, even greater reminders of life loss. Specifically for me, at the time when I was trying to graduate with my doctorate in 2015, it was also the same time where we experienced the death of Mike Brown. Where I'm from in St. Louis is in the Ferguson, Florissant area. So, as we moved from dealing with the tragedy of Mike Brown and into the escalation of the community response and then the further escalation of the police response, these are things that were impacting the kind of calls and conversations that I would have with family and friends who were still living in the community at the time. Once again, the reason why we wanted to pause and share and saturate this conversation of life events is it's helpful if you can at least be honest with yourself about some of the things that were impactful, some of the things that, regardless of whether or not they were handled well in the moment, kind of impact the timeline and how you might show up and have any sort of expectations about receiving trauma-informed facilitation or being prepared to be someone who is themselves the trauma-informed facilitator. We want to just pause and get you all to interact with us for a second. And so what you see in front of you is known as the mood meter. This is a tool that has been designed by Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and it's been in use for probably over a decade at this time. It falls into the conversations of social emotional learning or emotional intelligence. And so this is a chance. When we think about trauma-informed facilitation, the simpler language that we want to bring people to is how do we deal in instances where people are in heightened, high energy, high negative emotions. And before we get into that conversation, we want to check in with you all right now. So we're looking to just pause for a second. What color do you most identify with right now? Love to either welcome you to unmute if you're willing to unmute, or go ahead and let you drop it in the chat if that is more comfortable based on your environment. Okay, Alicia came through with the green. Terry is yellowish green. Okay, it's close. That lets me know directionally. Megan has hit us with the blue. And anyone else? Okay, Danielle with the green.
I'm going
Christina
to
with
say
the green.
yellow.
Okay, yellow. Before I move forward, I do just want to point out to you all that once again, before you can engage others in a trauma-informed way, you have to be in a place where you're okay with. There are no wrong answers to how you might be feeling. All emotions are information. However, you might not be as able to facilitate a conversation if you're in the red, right? You might not be as able to facilitate the conversation if you're in the yellow. once again, you have to just manage how you are feeling and how that shows up in your work, but also in how others are serving you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Cooper. So moving into the another interactive phase, right? Because we wanted this to be a discussion. I want to ask the question: what are events that you all had that you would add to the timeline of events? Chat, you could throw it in the chat, or you could unmute. But what are some of the events that you would add to the timeline? Let's just say that to Danielle and I's timeline. I assume we're all here. From the 90s till now. We'll let you think on that for a moment. Very recent. Yep. Dr. Allen for sure. So, yeah, and we are in Connecticut, so that one definitely hits home. Okay. Yep, Megan,
I would say, you named the George Floyd of it all, but in 2015, we were inundated, honestly, back then, not just, so that's when we lost Sandra Bland. That's when, we had already just lost Trayvon Martin at that time. So just the whole of, I don't know, both gun violence and seemingly, police citizen interaction violence that was going on.
at the same time, there was a pandemic. Right on time, Dr. Allen. There was a global pandemic that I won't say nobody, right? But like our elderest elders had been around during the 1900 flu, 1918, and had an opportunity to live through that to experience COVID. And so in talking about the types of events, so a part of my background is emergency management. The other part is public health, in whichever order. And a part of that, my background was being a public health preparedness coordinator. And so when we talk about events, we generally say things in that space of emergencies being local, right? Like they start local, and that's normally because they do. But if we were gonna, shrink that down to a personal level, right? Like when things happen, they occur to us. And so while they may also occur to our neighbors, our family, our community, right? They ultimately occur to us and it impacts us. And so from that aspect, from the emergency management, the public health aspect, there could be any number of things that we consider to be, threats or hazards. And so from the natural world, you've already named them, like pandemics, epidemics, floods, tornadoes. For instance, in Florida, we just had a hurricane, right? It was Milton that came through and spun off tornadoes, right? So even in that kind of impact, there's technological issues that we've seen. I didn't mention Y2K, which was a big scare at the moment, but we thought computers were going to crash and everything was going in and planes were going to fall out of the sky, right? Like, so we were geared up and the stress was there. And then it was a big, like, right, like a big sigh of relief. So there are technological things that we can be concerned with, and that stress can be there. There are human cause, which are largely the things we deal with, and you could probably do a root cause analysis and make everything human cause. But as Danielle pointed out, we've got active shooter or armed assaults. There are cyber attacks, there are explosive attacks, terrorist attacks. So all of these types of things and events have occurred and are still occurring right now as we sit in this space to be able to discuss it. So with that, I think we may be able to move on to the next slide, Danielle.
I'll add just one quick thing if I could. Part of what you're acknowledging is like some things are bigger or like impact more people or are more interpersonal versus like actually happening out. But in terms of just also bringing it to the things that happen to us in higher ed, these include events like the university closing, massive shifts in leadership, massive shifts in administrative staffing or closing of any of programs. Sometimes this is your dissertation advisor no longer being a good person. Sometimes they pass. Sometimes the committee member isn't present anymore. So I just want to acknowledge that, we mean those things that happen outside of our world in the Black Doctoral Network, but we also mean all of those things that happen inside of the world of us trying to pursue our degrees, pursue our careers, and that are sometimes very academia specific. So I'll move you to your next slide.
No, good point. And that's the reason that this is a discussion and not a lecture style, right? So we could do that. So with that being said, right, I've asked you what were the events that you would add to the timeline. And so the next question is like, how do you remember these events being responded to? In your personal timeline, when things have occurred, how were they responded to? Because they could be responded to in different ways. Danielle, go ahead and hit that for me. Uh, were they responded to in appreciated ways, right? Like, was there a positive response to the event that occurred? I'll use an example when we talk about natural disasters or something like that. When communities are built back, some communities are built back quite differently in where we are. And there's been a big push at the federal level, FEMA, to try and make things more equitable, right? But if we look at what happened with Katrina, those people that were relocated never got their homes back. Like, people moved to other states and never returned. And so I could say, there are definitely times when we've had positive responses, and we come together and we do things. And then there's times when the responses have yielded negative results, right? So that the both sides of that coin, how are the events that you identify in your timeline, how were they responded to? Was it in appreciated ways or was it harmful ways? And how did that then impact you going forward?
And I'll kind of tie in some of the ways we already mentioned. When I heard you talk about being injured as a young person and there being like that pencil break, that actual physical injury, I have heard you in our lives say that your family was protective, but they also understood that you was a child, like, in that you wasn't trying to hurt yourself, and it was like kids make mistakes, and that they just move forward and trying to get to the solution as opposed to doing the blame game when something serious happens. Um, I think for myself, I think of the instance that I brought up, being in high school and experiencing 9/11. And honestly, they could have kept us in the dark. They could have made it so that we had, it wasn't the same as 2024. So it's not like we had cell phones at the same way as we have now. But they were very transparent with us. They did not, communicate anything that wasn't true. So they knew that some of us had relatives on the East Coast. So they just say, hey, all we have is the ability to kind of pause and not pretend like nothing is happening. And I think even just the not pretending like nothing is happening, when you're a child, you don't always know whether you should trust the adults in the space. And when the adults let you know that they're keying you in, like, hey, I can let you know this much, but that kind of helps, I think, sometimes with people, even as adults, to just feel more settled into what might still be chaos. But at least I know that you're not keeping information from me and I don't have to wonder if that's happening.
The message you put in the chat, who was responsible for responding? I think that's kind of what makes me think about that, right? Because I'm thinking during COVID, we didn't have answers, right? And so if I was a kid during COVID, my world changed. I have no answers. Your parents were not responsible for responding in that moment, right? But how would you know that? Everybody's looking for somebody else to have an answer. and no one really did. And even with that, I think um, when I talk to some of my students and we think about how short term our memories are around COVID, is like people wanted to get back to normal so quickly that we didn't sit in, and maybe they didn't want to sit in it, but like they didn't really absorb the years that had passed. We just kind of like tucked them away in a box and tried to move forward, but yet still we're seeing the impacts of what that did to us now, and we will probably see it, going forward.
I think you raise a really good point of how sometimes we might have an intention of doing good. So we do bring it up. But often, especially in academic spaces, we have some sort of deadline, timeline, standard that we're trying to meet. So if I have to be pressured about where we are in the schedule, I may just bring it up gently, like, hey, I want y'all to know, I understand a little disaster happened last week, but we don't have to talk. And sometimes that is harmful. That gives people confusion about whether or not you actually understand the depth of the impact of what's going on. It also gives people confusion about whether or not you're actually inviting them to share and deal with any of the emotionality that might be related to the impact, of the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and move on. It was something that when the last thing you said, it really made me think about the the story that I told you about my student who we were in class, and he came to me and said that he was kind of dealing with some stuff. And once we got into it, he explained it. But like his family was in the earthquake in Turkey, and they had lost their home, but his family was still alive, like his mom, his dad, his sister. And he was like, yeah, I'm extremely blessed because my family is still alive. Like we don't have a house anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
my family is alive. Now, the thing is that he's here in the United States in school, and they're in Turkey dealing with this. And he's got to deal with that because it is his family, and he is in the classroom. He's still trying to deal with that at the same time. So that was just something that jumped in my mind the last time you said that.
That's very good for this segue of where we are, because the reality is that in order to be trauma informed, you have to check your own understanding of trauma. That's one of the first like skills that we want to make sure the people in this call are kind of addressing for themselves. And when you think about trauma, this is actually something that is being discussed a lot more, I think, than it has been in the past. But honestly, this has been in the field for about, let's see, since the 70s. Is when we think of traumatology really building up its chomps as a discipline and a field. When you all as an audience think about your understanding of trauma, what is your understanding, or where does that understanding come from? I think one of you mentioned you might be in the actual medical space as a nurse. So, trauma has a real medical meaning, but we also mean it socially and societally in the way that we're going to talk about it. So does anyone want to share in the chat or unmute and share any thoughts on how do you all see and understand trauma? What's your current understanding? I think part of the way that we hear it discussed sometimes is what is big T trauma, and sometimes we're saying, what is the biggest things that could happen and be disastrous versus little T trauma? What are things that are personal? Before I go into actually defining acute and chronic trauma for you all, I think the most important things to remember is that it is currently the best practice to assume that everyone is experiencing some level of trauma. And that if you then take what we're going to move forward with in terms of being more trauma informed, then when you encounter people, you may potentially soften the story that you tell them as conflicts arise, as unacceptable behavior arise, as disappointment arises, but also as different, once again, events that create elevated negative emotions around the conversation. So when you think about what your understanding of trauma is, the reality is that the exact same event may be traumatic to me and not traumatic to you. The exact same event may not be traumatic to me when it happens to me at one point in my life, and may be completely debilitating to me at a different point in my life. So as I move forward, part of it is to just keep an open mind about how we define and experience trauma. Many times when we are thinking of trauma, we are talking about exposure to a single overwhelming traumatic event. We say to ourselves, that was traumatic, and we mean something acute. This can be how you feel after a car accident, right? This can be how you feel if there has been some sort of incident where your safety was compromised, where you have had to deal with a massive, overwhelming event, okay? But not everything is a single event, and we want to provide space to acknowledge that there might be something that happens that is in one instance that is later showing up in our lives, or there might be an acknowledgement that there are multiple forms of trauma that repeatedly occur over an extended period of time. This is the place where we talk about what is commonly known as post-traumatic. What does regular PTSD stand for? Post-traumatic syndrome and disorder. But also when you think about it in the context of Black people and other marginalized people, you've got Dr. Joyce DeGruy, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. You've just got a lot of conversation about race-based stress and trauma and other forms in which, especially whether you think of yourself as Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, whether you think of yourself from your gendered perspective and what it looks like, whether you get even more in-depth and complicated, honestly, we talk about the fact that you were a seed in your mother when your mother was inside of your grandmother's womb. And therefore, when you think about the complication of like the epigenetics or the complicatedness of what it means for your environment to be well beyond your control, your environment and the things you're exposed to and how that impacts you, especially in how that shows up in your body. Once again, doesn't matter if it's acute or if it's chronic trauma. These are things that we, especially when we have power over classrooms, when we have power over meetings, we're especially needing to acknowledge the problem that many people are not aware of trauma, and then move into the reality that as we become more aware, people are many times at a skills deficit where they are not actually prepared well for how to manage what we can do when we are faced with conversations. How can we move into that trauma-informed facilitation? So I'll pass back to you. You are on mute.
I was trying to be respectful. So what we want to talk about right now is some of the frameworks for the guidance and some of the things that Danielle and I have gone back and forth with for this presentation. While there are many, these are the ones that we felt were most applicable here. So one is Plane Tree International, which is a person-centered view that I learned via school. I'll get into that. Next, we will talk about adverse childhood experiences. That again, I come from also a public health background, and so that is that's stipulated there as well. Then Danielle will move into restorative practices, and then she will wrap that section up with trauma-informed resources. So first, we'll move into Plane Tree. Like I said, Plane Tree International is a person-centered healthcare approach that I was first exposed to in my program in health sciences here at the University of New Haven. And so move on, open that up for me, Danielle. And so in this Venn diagram, what you'll see are the three components of Plane Tree. And so what we did at the University of New Haven in health sciences was apply this to the classroom. And so while it's person-centered care, it does still apply to one's education. And so when they being the students and me being the instructor or facilitator in the classroom, one of the areas that we want to make sure we focus on are thinking about the fact that they have to care for, we have to care for our, in this moment, my students, but also their loved ones, right? So the example that I gave you of my student whose family was in the earthquake in Turkey, the fact that he was willing to share with me what he was going through allowed me to have more empathy in the moment for both him and his loved ones, which then maybe even allowed for him to be more present in the moment where we were in the space, because he could see that I was, there with him. Additionally, the another area that we have is caring for staff or colleagues, right? And so, how does it feel when you are in an environment that is supportive versus one that isn't supportive? I mean, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to be best friends, but we should be collegial. And the fact that I should care about what's going on in your life, maybe not in detail, but I want to know what's going on. I definitely don't there's an example. It's a really bad example, but there's an example most recently of someone who worked herself to death in her cubicle, and they did not find her for days later, until days later. If there was anyone caring for their colleagues, I'm sure that, and maybe it was because it was a large office building, but we are out of touch with one another. And so the third piece that goes into this person-centered care approach is caring for the community as a whole. Again, coming from a public health background, I think about One Health, I think about holistic health. And in terms of this particular angle, an individual is not solely comprised of what they experience, but also what their families experience, maybe what their colleagues experience, and also what their community experiences. And so taking those things into account when being present during facilitation can allow for the participants to maybe let down some of those protective barriers that we often have up, to allow ourselves to be more trusting and vulnerable in that environment, and then get more out of those experiences. Next slide, please.
Before we move forward, I just
No
want
problem.
to, because the goal here is we want you all to think about this as skills, right? So if you can first think internally about how you have had different experiences and how those experiences have impacted you, that's one piece. The next piece that we bring you to is understanding that sometimes trauma is what looks like an incident, like the acute definition, and sometimes it's a lot harder to distinguish because it has happened and it becomes a lot more woven into the environment. And what the plane tree piece that you bring to the table, Dr. Cooper, really helps us tie in is that we must be open-minded. Once we have the definitions of acute trauma and of chronic trauma, then we have to be open-minded to who can be traumatized and how they might have come to that traumatizing experience. So sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's vicarious trauma. And when we ask ourselves, how can we be more mindful of this? We have to realize that the student in front of us, the coworker in front of us, the police officer in front of us, they represent more than that one body. And they represent more than their individual trauma that they might be bringing into the conversation.
Thank you for that. And so what I have here is an example that is of a personal policy, classroom policy that I share with my students that has been updated for, make sure I'm speaking the proper slang with this, with the students, with the young folk. But life be lifing, ultimately, is what I want to let them know, right? And you probably hear it if you just pay attention to anything social media. Life is definitely lifing right now, and it's lifing at full speed. And so taking the time, the moments to articulate that does build connection, because I want to make sure that I keep going back to that part, that I'm trying to share with you all some facilitation tactics and some strategies that we use. And like, so this is one of the things that I make sure I go over, because I mean, ultimately we never really know when the straw that might break that camel's back, right? That proverbial straw. We don't know what instance an individual goes through that is too much for them to handle. We are in this world that allows us to keep going, or maybe forces us to keep going, and so we don't ever slow down enough to do that. So I like to do that in my general facilitation, but definitely in the classroom. All right, moving forward. So the next area I wanted to speak about was adverse childhood experiences. So if anyone has heard of this in the chat, you could just say yes, you have, throw a Y in there. Yes, you have heard of adverse childhood experiences before. But again, from the public health angle that I come from, these were some of the tools that I was given to kind of be able to like frame up what we're dealing with in the community when we talk about community health and trying to encourage people to do things that might be good for them in terms of like health education, in terms of what might even be the health belief model and stuff like that. So some of the areas, if you Google it, you might find up to 10 or more, but some of the areas that we have for adverse childhood experiences, which essentially are early things that have lasting impacts on us, are injuries, dealing with mental health, issues with maternal health, dealing with infectious diseases, dealing with chronic diseases, which is a bigger killer now than even more acute diseases, risky behaviors, which come to us in all forms, and then opportunities or lack thereof, right? That lead onto it. And so what I wanted to say real quick, right? I try to find a good definition. It was like adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events that happen between ages 1 and 17. So once they trigger 18, we're calling you an adult. Which I'll say something about that in a second. But these negative experiences affect the child's brain and health as they grow into young adults and adults. ACEs can lead to mental health or chronic health conditions, and only lifelong treatment and management can help a person lead a fulfilling life once they've been identified. And so there is a survey that you can get an ACEs score, and there is a benchmark that if you have so many adverse childhood experiences that it is indicative of health impacts later in life. Maybe not specific impacts, but definitely health impacts that are negative impacts. And so, I mean, I myself have already shared that I had some early adversity in my own life. But when you look at these, if you can see them, think to yourself. You don't necessarily have to share, but you are more than welcome to share via the chat. Did you experience any of these areas of early adverse childhood experience in your life? Maybe you even put it out of your mind because it was so traumatic. But have you had to experience these things, and how did you deal with it? Right? Like, how did you come out of it? Have you come out of it? And before I pass it to Danielle, the thing that I had said a few years ago when I was studying ACEs, I was like, man, we need to talk about adverse adult experiences.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, man, bankruptcies, foreclosures, divorces, separations, loss of
Loss of
parents,
parents.
loss of parents, loss of siblings, like all these things. Like adults are very much still going through things and that we're still growing and developing. We're still dealing with issues ourselves, and so I want to be able to have more empathy for us in our own experiences as adults, but to make sure that we are aware that maybe some of what we feel now started a long time ago.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that this is guidance that is relevant and that helps us all create a broader mindset of the goal in being trauma informed is that we will respond better. That when people come to us because they are not performing maybe at the way that we would consider ideal, their behavior is not what we would consider acceptable, that we, instead of saying this is a bad person doing a bad thing, we can say to ourselves, well, pause. Maybe I should ask some questions about what's going on. Maybe there are things either in my life that impact why I take this so offensively or seriously, or maybe there are things in the other person's life that help impact why they didn't bring it to me sooner. that could impact why they didn't advocate in the way that I think advocacy should look, or the way that I think I would have advocated for myself in the same situation. Specifically, this piece about the childhood, though, the millennial argument is that we did not make it through one developmental phase without seemingly the world crumbling. And when I talk to older generations and younger generations, they want me to understand that like bad things have happened to them too. But we just mean to say, like, you know, as we were graduating from high school, so much was going on. As we were graduating from college, so much was going on. As we were potentially, you know, to your point about these adverse adult experiences, to graduate from college and move back into your parents' house and to not have that potential promise of a successful career, to not have that promise of housing stability, to not have that promise of marital success is really a stressful point for many people, and how they're showing up in the spaces. And we know from the research that people under duress, people under stress, just have less resources to show up positively for themselves, but especially to show up positively for others. So you get less positivity from me when I'm strained. You get less creativity from me when I am stressed out.
Throttling that bandwidth.
Yeah. So the next piece that we want to, you know, tie you all into in terms of the frameworks that we're asking you to think about is the restorative practices piece. As a restorative practitioner, this is something that I really try to implement in a wide variety of places and spaces in my personal and professional life. The goal is to help human beings be happier, more cooperative, and more productive. But the challenge is, how do we get there? And really what the fundamental hypothesis tells us is that when we're in positions of authority, we must really take advantage of the opportunity to build community when we have that authority. And we can achieve that by doing things with people instead of for them, against them, or to them. So this is commonly seen in what is known as the social discipline window. So I just share this with you so that you can see we start at that bottom left lower box. If we don't care what you do and we don't care how you get it done and we are not at all concerned, it seems neglectful. And when you think about this from a trauma-informed perspective, this is when I have no desire for you to bring it up. I am not interested in any excuses. I am not going to provide any space for us to come to any sort of shared community understanding around these pieces. And then when you move up, maybe you are in your authority dynamic, you're being very controlling, right? You're limiting the opportunities and you're moving more toward discipline. And so you might punish people and say, everyone who shows up late every single time is always docked 5 points. And if you are late this many times, then you are definitely the most disrespectful person. You are not a caring classmate. You're not a caring colleague. Where I could have potentially asked questions and understood that maybe you always have childcare that gets out at a certain time, and that's why you're struggling with being there. And so instead of being so controlling and administering punishment to people, administering rules to people, we might have the chance to just ask people. I experience a lot that because of parking on my campus, my students struggle with what is the parking, the getting to class, and all those things. So then I use the first 5 to 10 minutes of class so that it is mutually beneficial. I use that time to review from the prior lesson. I use that time to check in so that if for some reason they do show up 10 minutes late, I'm able to manage that. So I choose not to be punitive. The other side of that moves you into the bottom right-hand box of being permissive, potentially, right? There's concern that if we just let everything go, and let everything happen, that's a different problem. Sometimes you see this where maybe we are trying to have the intention of engaging in conversation post some sort of traumatic event, post some sort of conflict. It could be conflict in the class, outside of society. And we say, oh, we're just going to open it up. But because we have no skill set in how to acknowledge it, we have students saying harmful things to each other. We have moments in which there's conversation and the students looking toward the teacher and trying to figure out why is there no level of actual facilitation and control to the conversation? Why are there not proper expectations and how we are having these conversations and working with each other? The more ideal situation, as once again, this restorative fundamental hypothesis brings you to, is we want to expect positive changes in behavior when those of us in positions do things with people, with our students, with our colleagues, with people that we are in community with. And that by doing things with them, we might be able to say to the class, hey, something heavy has happened. What do we need? Right? And because we're in conversation with that, we might decide that we need to pause and cancel the whole class. It's too big for us to pretend like something is not going on and that we will move forward as regular. We might need to say we need space. Nobody has given us a space to ask questions, to get answers, especially if we're young people and we don't have resources to potentially get proper answers to the questions by ourselves. We might say, hey, we think this is such a big problem. We wish that you in your power would stand with us and that we could go and ask someone else for a solution. Those are all ways that when we move into a more trauma-informed facilitation space, we achieve a width that will allow us to, as Dr. Cooper mentioned, increase the trust that we need to move forward, but also to build the space so that whatever rift has happened, sometimes the rift is within the group. Sometimes we are in conflict within the one room. And so we still might need to discuss it, create space for that. Those are the kind of framework that we get from the restorative practices. And so I have a question for each of you all, right? Here we are. We have been in this session, and part of the true conversation is how can you develop skills to become more trauma informed? You know, one step is being here with us. Another step, part of what we've talked to you about, is in order to be trauma informed, you must actually be trauma aware in yourself, trauma aware in your environment, and that as you have that information, you can be more aware of what it means to move through your intent. Maybe you had an intent to be open. Maybe you had an intent for discussion, and really situate yourself in the fact of the impact. Maybe you opened up a discussion and people in the room cried. Maybe you opened up a space for students to give presentations, and the reality is that the video that the student showed was offensive to other students in the room. Maybe you're in a work meeting and the thing that someone thinks is a joke is not really a joke to you because of the realities and the trauma that you have dealt with and the things that you know to be offensive based on your own lived experiences. So next, as we move forward, we just have a few more tips for you all before we wrap up so that you can think about specifically your facilitation skills as you are trying to make sure and monitor the impact that you have in the spaces that you have authority in. So what facilitation skills do you have? I'm just going to pause here for a second. I need to see you all in the chat. What do you already claim? Whatever words you use when you show up in a space and you consider yourself to be facilitating, what are the skills that you claim to go with that facilitation? So what skills go with you leading a classroom? What skills go with you leading a meeting? What skills go with you being at the front of any sort of congregation? Thank you, Giselle. Definitely active listening. Number one, something we're going to talk about in a second. Anything else besides listening? Listening's important. But if you showed up after a traumatic event and all I did was say, I'm here to listen, you might be a little discouraged. I see Dr. Cletus Allen say dialogue, right? Dialogue means that there is an actual opportunity for interaction and communication, and that discussion can be robust. Sometimes you're looking for community after a traumatic event, and you want to know that you're not gaslighting yourself into thinking that it's not that big of a deal, that it didn't really happen, that it doesn't really impact that many people, that you're not taking it the right level of seriousness. So all of those things come into play. I hear open body language from Dr. Cooper. Seeing if I'm missing anything else. Okay. I am here to walk you quickly through the 6 core facilitation skills that you yourself should be trying to manage, and then how you weave that into trauma-informed facilitation is what we've been discussing. Now that you can better understand the ways in which it might be a challenge and how people present themselves and how you interpret their behaviors and how you can be more open-minded and curious to how they show up, how do you show up as the leader of the conversation, as the facilitator? As you all pointed out, there is no such thing as facilitation without listening. Thank you very much for sharing that comment. We want to emphasize active listening. That's what you all pointed out in the chat. Listening, they say there's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, but the reality is that listening is a challenge for most of us. Listening means that we are not doing that thing called waiting to respond. You know how you're still hearing, and you say, well, as soon as they take a breath, I can't wait to tell them the 12 things that I've been thinking. So make sure that as you try to manage the listening, that you are actually giving yourself presence. You might need to do some breathing activities. You might need to deal with your own trauma before you can be in a space to properly listen to someone else tell you about their situation without you doing the Mr. Me Too. Well, me too. I also had a bad thing happen to me. Me too. I also had a feeling that I felt that one time. When in reality, the person or the people or the group that you're stewarding and you're trying to create space and honoring their trauma, they may just need you to listen. What else might they need from you? Often we're listening and then we're also expecting reflecting. Reflecting means, how did I feel about it? What happened? What do I understand? What questions do I still have about it? Just giving yourself, or once again, the people whose trauma you're stewarding, the space to be curious, the space to realize that it's okay to have questions. It's okay with the emotions that are created when you have those questions. All of those things are a part of the space that you want to produce, right? So these are the first 2 skills. We're going to listen, and part of that listening is you're going to make sure that the room is reflecting. So we want to create space in which people are saying things. People are also thinking about the impact of how they got to this moment, the impact of what they might want from the future. We should all be encouraging if we're in the facilitation space. The reality is that we are not the same talkative, and that my most introverted people tell me that they pretty much have like a 4 or 5 second rule. That truly introverted people have no desire to do that waiting to respond thing. They have no desire to interject. They're going to wait until there's a legitimate pause in the conversation. So if you're the facilitator, you have to be mindful as you're listening and as people are reflecting to encourage more full engagement, to encourage people who can say maybe other contrasting views. So you have to be mindful of what's happening in the moment, and you can encourage more people to share their voice, more people to share details, more people to share like questions or contrasting experiences. Also, as the facilitator, right, these last 3 skills I would say are the more advanced skills, right? Are you prepared to question? As people are reflecting, are you prepared to ask them questions that are open-ended questions that help them get more out? Are you prepared to question in the critical sense, where they might be presenting something and your question is really to ask them about what's not being said, to ask them about what's not being put in the priority, so that maybe other pieces of the conversation can be put forth. The other thing to think about with questioning is to encourage questioning as well. So once again, as the body that you're dealing with, as you're thinking how they are reflecting, and as you're encouraging them to speak up, we can also be encouraging them to ask themselves questions, ask each other's questions, and ask you as the facilitator questions. The last 2 pieces are just admittedly more complicated. Sometimes as the facilitator, you must intervene. And this is where a lot of participant disappointment comes in. If you have been in a space where you can feel that the facilitator has completely lost control and that they do not pause the conversation, they are not intervening if conflict is arising, if disrespect is arising, those are things where people can tell that they're not in a safe space And when there is not proper intervening, the trust of the facilitator is lost. People are less likely to feel encouraged to participate. They're less likely to be willing to answer those questions. And then the last skill that I bring you all to is clearing. Sometimes conflicts happen and we have to be prepared to help people. We have to be prepared to deal with the actual conflicts that may arise. So what may be traumatic to you, I may be on the opposite side of that traumatic event. Let me give you an example. I'm a woman who's a Black woman living in my Black body. I serve and work as a criminal justice professional. There are things that I can say that might be triggering to my colleagues who are police officers or who are in investigations in other spaces. And there are things that they might say that are offensive to me and how I think of myself in community and how I think of myself as having sometimes being harmed by police-citizen interactions. So sometimes we have to have a clearing. And in those clearings, that's mostly when we see the opportunity to separate the intent from the impact. The clearing means that we have to acknowledge that disrespect has occurred. The clearing means that we have to acknowledge that we have belittled or limited or neutralized someone's experiences, regardless of whether or not that was the intention and how the comment was intended to be phrased or stated. We have to not let our job as the facilitator run amok. So while we're managing the first three things of listening, reflecting, and encouraging, we have to also realize that sometimes complicated things come up. People may want to blame and offer and place accountability at the foot, either of people in the room or people outside of the room. People may, when they're questioning, they may get angry, they may get sad. All of these questioning, intervening, and clearing are ways for once the harder parts of the conversation come up, you remember that it is still within your role as the facilitator to potentially intervene and set the pace, to potentially clear and create space where we pause and create more honest clarity around the actual impact of the things that have been going on. And just to acknowledge, it is your presence, how you show up. Once again, that's informed by being aware of your own experiences with your own trauma. That's by being aware of your own skill set and what you're seeking to do and how you facilitate proactively before different actual traumatic or high negative emotion events take place. So how you show up before an incident and how you show up after an incident, all of these are critical pieces to trauma-informed facilitation.
This is your slide.
Perfect. I forgot that part. So in highlighting those skills, we just want to remind you that learning is fundamental and that you cannot do, listening is fundamental, and that you are not able to access the other skills of questioning, clearing, intervening, if you are not also prepared to listen. That means that you have to take into your own account how ready you are to be a facilitator, and be mindful of what might be triggering or upsetting to you as you move into these spaces where you're stewarding other people's trauma as well. And then I just want to, before I pass to Terry, this is an excellent quote, right? As you balance teaching and facilitating, we'd like it if you all keep these three goals in mind. You should create safe space. You should create a place where participants feel seen and heard. And you should invite full participation. As you do these things, you should create an environment where participants can immerse themselves fully. You should attend to the challenges that you see come up in the group. Once again, if there's tension between members in the group, if there are conversations that are being taken too lightly or neutralized, those are things for you to do. And so when obstacles, upsets, or confusions occur, you have to mediate the energy between the individuals and the group, and that you have different types of practices such as reflection, such as having people do different like role play and other things that will help people consider how it is that they would like you to be with them during the traumatic events that they are managing.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I say there's a song for everything. And I remember Eminem had a song when he was like, is what you said is what you said, but remember how you were saying it. And this quote from Maya Angelou definitely encompasses that as well. When she said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that too often we let this slide by without even acknowledging the fact that yeah, like our sticks and stones may break my bones, but although we said words don't hurt us, but the yeah, your intent and your impact might not be aligning, and so yeah, they still hurt, right? And then they stay with me. All right, next one. So this is one that we put in and from Bell Hooks, and I thought it was great to wrap up the conversation with this. That rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. And I would just like to, let us sit with that, take that with you, um, and I hope that it, has some impact on you.
Before we go off this slide, I'd just like to, add that oftentimes it's our trauma that makes us believe that we have to do it alone, that we are alone in the experiences that are themselves traumatic, and that it's just not true. And the Black Doctoral Network spends a lot of time and energy bringing us together, whether it's in workshops like this, whether it's at the national conferences, trying to allow us space to heal together and not in isolation. So I'm thankful for that.
Mhm. And so, in closing, reach out to us. I would say like, share, subscribe, but I don't have a YouTube page. But definitely connect with us on LinkedIn. Um, both of our information is right here. You can find us both on LinkedIn on Dr. Danielle Cooper and Terry TC Cooper on LinkedIn. Our email addresses are there if you want to reach out to us. Danielle, you have anything you want to close with?
No, we are just very thankful for the opportunity to share with you all as members or guests as the Black Doctoral Network, and we look forward to future opportunities to share.
All right. Thank you.
I want to say thank you too for this very engaging, thoughtful, empowering session. I'm a writer, so I just want you guys know I've been writing some tips and things because I want to share some of these in other spaces that I belong to. Very, very necessary. And I really just enjoyed this presentation. And I know the others who were here in this workshop really, really, really enjoyed it as well. We have about a minute. If anyone has any questions for our facilitators, I will go ahead and give you guys the floor. Just to let you guys know, we also have our workshop evaluation in the chat. So go ahead and fill that out. That will be great.
Hi, whoops. I get a minute, right?
Yes, we're about 45 now, but go ahead.
Okay. Quick question, and you might have already covered this during the talk, but one of the issues that we're having at NAU is with this fear that if you have an open space for discussions, and professors have talked about, having students say questionable things in class and then being afraid to address them because they have HR issues or the student is going to give them a bad response. Is this something that you were discussing at some point during your presentation and I missed it?
No, we didn't get into the fact that sometimes the people who you're providing the opportunity, that you're facilitating, they may not, even view it as traumatic. So they may come in a lot more raw to the conversation, whereas others are actually protecting their energy and their spirit because the conversation may be a lot more personal to them. To your question, I think that what we can do is be proactive. and we can, in the spaces such as a classroom or a meeting, we can come to that classroom and say to them, what types of conversations do we think happen here? And what do we think then happens when conflict arises? And we can go ahead and before that conflict, before it's like, we can ask them, what do you think happens? Because that's what's going to happen here. And I would encourage us to put in those situations a lot more of the student to student responsibility. So students are often not clear about what it looks like for a proper conversation, debate, and correction to take place. We have to be proactive in telling them what it looks like to disagree, not move into ad hominem or other personal types of spaces, while acknowledging that doesn't seem evidentially strong. That doesn't seem to be a very credible argument. That seems to be disproven. There are plenty of disagreements that we have in academia, and seemingly our students are missing ways that we're modeling for them that we've had debates all along. We don't debate our humanity, but there's lots of strategies that we're debating that people have a lot of disagreements about how we respond once the traumatic event has occurred, or how we respond once there's been a violation of some sort societally or in the community.
Thank you so much.
So
Yeah, I
Giselle,
wanted to
to
chime
wrap
in.
it up, I would just say, talk to those people who you believe would later violate you well before they have that chance. So ask people what it looks like for them in that class to be at that type of contention well before it gets that contentious.
That's what I was going to point out, right? Like, you had given me the idea of classroom agreements
Yeah.
early on. And it's like we identify what is and what isn't disrespect, and what is and what isn't the etiquette for the classroom, and the decorum that we want to see in the classroom. Now, granted, the topic the topic may or may not be tense, right? But if we are mature about it, we should be able to maneuver in a way that does not put one in jeopardy as the instructor facilitator or those student participants, in terms of what they're dealing with as well.
I would add just one more quick thing, Giselle. When you are dealing with the spaces where we, have these the kind of other piece that I would bring into it, the class agreements is very helpful. The other piece is that once those class agreements exist, it becomes a point of accountability. I give them to the students. I later ask them if we no longer agree. When we're now in a broken space, do we no longer agree to these things? Is there something that we need to do to reset? And that's that intervening and clearing piece that goes with those facilitation skills as well. Once it's off the rocker, meaning that we're no longer where we're having a productive conversation, how do I either pause or stop the conversation? How do I acknowledge the harm in the conversation? Those are where those more upper level skills come in.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry if we went over time, and I look forward to the recording because I see I missed a very good presentation. Thank you so much
for being here.
And thank you
Dr.
for your
Cooper.
question. It was really engaging. And again, I'm a writer, so I was writing strategies
It warms
down.
my heart to know that you took notes, that I am also of the note-taking variety. I just want to encourage you all, when November 5th and 6th are potentially heavily days in which you will be engaged in trauma-informed facilitation. And you have to ask yourself, are you willing to prepare that you might not get the amount of lecture covered or the stuff that you might have planned in meetings? Or you might have to admit you're not the one in control, and you might have to admit that you're going to be in a lot of spaces next week in which no one plans to ask you any sort of trauma-informed questions about how you're dealing with whatever happens next week.
And thank you for sharing that, Dr. Cooper. We're going to go ahead and close out our session. Again, we would like to thank Dr. Terry Cooper and Dr. Danielle Cooper for this informative session on trauma-informed facilitation. If you guys did not have a chance to listen, go ahead and listen to the recording when it comes out. Just to share some upcoming events for BDN. The next workshop is actually today at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The title of that workshop will be Staying Connected, Empowering Doctoral Students to Enhance Mental Health and Well-Being. So if you have an opportunity, go ahead and jump right back into our workshop series today at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, next week on November 5th, there will be the BDN Virtual Writing and Productivity Retreat with Dr. Dion Hawkins. So if you are in a writing space or you need to be productive, go ahead and join in with that retreat. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.